There is a room beneath the old Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. that does not appear on any blueprint filed after 1961. It sits 40 feet below the main corridor of Building 43, accessible only through a freight elevator whose call button was removed decades ago and whose shaft was reportedly sealed with poured concrete sometime during the Kennedy administration. Those who worked in that room during its brief operational life, a span of no more than 14 months between the autumn of 1958 and the winter of 1959, were among the most gifted signal analysts, radio astronomers, and cryptolinguists the United States government had ever assembled. They were given no project name, no official designation, no inter-office memoranda with routing numbers that might one day surface in a Freedom of Information Act request. They were, by every bureaucratic measure, invisible, and yet the work they performed in that buried, windowless, fluorescent-lit chamber may represent the single most consequential discovery in the history of human civilization, not because of what they found, though what they found defies every framework we possess for understanding our place in the cosmos, but because of what happened to every person who tried to understand it, because every institution, every committee, every quiet task force that dared to pursue the implications of what was heard coming from beneath the surface of the moon was, within 12 months of its formation, permanently and inexplicably dissolved. Their records were not merely classified, they were unmade, and the people who created those records were scattered to the wind, reassigned to posts so remote and so trivial that their expertise would never again intersect with the question that had consumed them. Tonight, we descend into that room, we listen to what they heard, and we follow the trail of silence that extends from 1958 to the present day, a silence so absolute and so meticulously maintained that its very existence constitutes the loudest confession imaginable. To understand what was detected beneath the lunar surface in the autumn of 1958, you must first understand the state of desperation that gripped the American space program in the months following the launch of Sputnik. On the 4th of October, 1957, the Soviet Union placed a polished aluminum sphere into low Earth orbit, and with it shattered the foundational assumption upon which American post-war confidence had been built, the assumption that technological supremacy belonged irrevocably to the West. The sound of Sputnik's radio beacon, that steady, maddening beep transmitted at 20.005 and 40.002 MHz, was picked up by amateur radio operators around the world, and it became the soundtrack of a national humiliation. Within weeks, President Eisenhower authorized a frantic acceleration of rocket development programs that had been languishing in bureaucratic limbo. The Army Ballistic Missile Agency, the Naval Research Laboratory, the Air Force's nascent satellite programs, all were suddenly flooded with funding and stripped of the inter-service rivalries that had kept them fractured. It was in this atmosphere of panic, of institutional chaos, of overlapping mandates and competing agendas that a small, unnamed program was authorized in the spring of 1958 to conduct what was described in the only surviving requisition document as preliminary passive signal reconnaissance of cislunar space. The program had no acronym. Its funding was buried in a line item for cafeteria maintenance at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and its purpose, as would become clear only decades later, was not to listen to space in general. It was to listen to the moon. The probe itself, if it can even be called that, was not a spacecraft in any conventional sense. It was a receiver, a deeply sensitive, cryogenically cooled radio antenna array, designed not for broadcast but for the most exquisite form of listening the technology of 1958 could achieve. It was mounted aboard a modified Atlas rocket designated only by the serial number LR7, a number that does not appear in any public launch manifest from Cape Canaveral or Vandenberg. The available evidence, drawn from fragments of decommissioned logbooks that surfaced briefly in a 1994 estate sale before being purchased by an anonymous buyer, suggests that LR7 was launched from a temporary facility on Johnston Atoll in the Central Pacific, far from the prying eyes of the press corps that had begun to haunt the Florida launch sites. The launch window was narrow, calculated to place the receiver in a translunar injection trajectory that would carry it within 60 miles of the lunar surface before swinging back toward Earth on a free return path. The entire mission, from launch to splashdown of the instrument package, was designed to last no more than 112 hours. In that time, the receiver would spend approximately 19 hours within optimal range of the moon, its antenna trained on the surface, drinking in whatever electromagnetic whispers the ancient, airless rock might offer. The engineers who built it expected to hear nothing. The cosmic background hum, perhaps some faint reflected solar radiation. The silence of a dead world confirmed. What they heard instead would ensure that none of them ever spoke publicly about their work again. The signal was first detected at 3:47 Greenwich Mean Time on the 11th of October, 1958, approximately 9 hours after LR-7 achieved its closest approach to the lunar surface. The receiver was passing over the southern edge of Oceanus Procellarum, the vast basaltic plain known as the Ocean of Storms, when the signal processing equipment aboard the instrument package registered an anomaly. It was not a burst. It was not static. It was a structured, repeating waveform emanating not from the surface of the moon, but from beneath it. The depth was difficult to calculate with the instrumentation available, but preliminary analysis conducted in the weeks that followed placed the source at somewhere between 800 meters and 2 kilometers below the regolith. The signal was extraordinarily low in frequency, hovering at the boundary between radio waves and infrasound, in a range that should have been impossible for natural geological processes to produce with such mechanical regularity. It repeated every 47 seconds, a cycle so precise that the variance across the hours of recorded data was less than 3 milliseconds. This was not the random emanation of cooling rock or subsurface tidal stress. This was something that possessed rhythm, something that possessed intention. The technicians at the Naval Research Laboratory who first processed the raw data from the recovered instrument package reportedly sat in absolute silence for nearly 10 minutes after the playback concluded. One of them, a veteran signals analyst who had spent the Second World War breaking Japanese naval codes, is said to have removed his headphones, placed them gently on the console, and whispered a single word that his colleagues would remember for the rest of their lives. He said, "Music." In the weeks that followed the recovery of LR-7 data, a small team of analysts began the painstaking work of characterizing the signal. They mapped its frequency spectrum. They measured its amplitude variations. They cataloged every micro-fluctuation in its repeating cycle, and they found something that none of them were prepared for. The signal was not a single tone. It was a composite waveform, a layering of multiple frequencies that, when separated and analyzed individually, formed what could only be described as a harmonic structure. There were overtones. There were intervals. There was something that, in the language of music theory, could be called a scale. Though it did not correspond to any Western tuning system, the intervals were strange, microtonal, distributed in ways that made the Western-trained ears of the analysts uncomfortable, as if they were hearing a melody that their brains could almost but not quite resolve into something recognizable. The signal did not simply repeat. It evolved through a cycle, ascending through a series of tonal steps before returning to its origin pitch and beginning again, a pattern that one analyst described in his private notes as liturgical. It had the architecture of a chant, it had the pacing of a prayer, and it was coming from inside the moon, from a place where no atmosphere existed to carry sound, where no known geological mechanism could produce organized acoustic phenomena, where no living thing had ever drawn breath. The team worked through November and into December of 1958, growing more isolated, more paranoid, more consumed by the data. They stopped going home at night. They stopped calling their families. They ate their meals in the subterranean room and slept on cots pushed against the walls. The signal had become their entire world, and with each new layer of analysis that world grew stranger. It was a civilian consultant, brought in under circumstances that remain unclear, who first suggested the connection that would transform the investigation from a signal analysis problem into something far more terrifying. Her name has never been confirmed, though fragments of internal correspondence refer to her only as Dr. M, and her area of expertise was not radio astronomy or signal processing but ancient Near Eastern languages. Specifically, she was one of fewer than 30 people alive in 1958 who could read Sumerian cuneiform with fluency. A scholar who had spent years at the University of Pennsylvania studying the clay tablets recovered from the ruins of Nippur, the great religious center of ancient Sumer. How she came to be involved in a classified signals intelligence project remains one of the most impenetrable mysteries of this entire affair, but her involvement suggests that someone within the chain of command had already begun to suspect what the signal might represent. Because when Dr. M was presented with a frequency analysis of the lunar signal, when she saw the intervals mapped out on graph paper, the ascending and descending tonal patterns charted in meticulous detail, she did not react with confusion. She reacted with recognition. She reached into her briefcase, withdrew a sheaf of her own research papers, and spread them across the table. They were transcriptions of Sumerian temple hymns, notated using a system she had developed for approximating the tonal values of ancient liturgical music. And there, on the page, in ink that had dried months before she ever heard of LR-7 or the signal beneath the moon, was a pattern that matched. not approximately, not suggestively. The tonal intervals of the lunar signal corresponded, within a margin of error so small as to be functionally zero, to a hymn dedicated to the god Enlil. To those unfamiliar with the Sumerian pantheon, the name Enlil may carry little weight, but to the people of ancient Mesopotamia, to the civilization that invented writing, that built the first cities, that gave humanity its earliest recorded myths, Enlil was not merely a god among gods. He was the supreme authority of the cosmos, the lord of wind and storm and command, the deity whose word was law and whose decrees could not be challenged even by other divine beings. The Sumerians believed that Enlil had been granted dominion over the earth after the primordial act of creation, that he stood at the apex of the divine hierarchy, the great mountain from which all order flowed. His temple at Nippur, the Eker, was considered the most sacred site in all of Sumer, and the hymns sung in his honor were among the oldest continuous liturgical traditions in recorded history. But there was something else about Enlil that the analysts in the subterranean room could not ignore, something that sent a chill through the sterile, recycled air of their underground chamber. The Sumerian texts were explicit in their assertion that Enlil was not of the earth. He had descended. He had come from above, from a place the Sumerians called the Great Above, a realm that was distinct from the heavens in ways that scholars have debated for over a century. Some tablets describe the Anunnaki, the pantheon to which Enlil belonged, as beings who came from the sky, who descended to the earth in the earliest ages and shaped humanity for purposes that the texts describe in language that oscillates between the reverential and the deeply unsettling. To find a hymn to Enlil encoded in a signal emanating from beneath the surface of the moon was not merely anomalous. It was, if taken at face value, a direct material confirmation of a mythological claim that mainstream archaeology had dismissed as primitive metaphor for thousands of years. The gods had come from above, and something beneath the moon was still singing to one of them. The reaction within the intelligence community was swift, compartmentalized, and ruthless in its efficiency. Within 48 hours of Dr. M's identification of the Sumerian correspondence, the project was elevated to a classification level so restricted that no surviving nomenclature exists for it. The team was forbidden from making copies of any documentation. All notes were to be written on specially watermarked paper that was collected and inventoried at the end of each working day. Communication with the outside world was suspended entirely. The analysts were informed that their families had been told they were participating in an extended training exercise at a facility in Alaska, a security detail from an agency that none of the team members could identify. Men who wore no insignia and carried no credentials took up permanent residence in the corridor outside the subterranean room, and that the visitors began to arrive. Over the course of January 1959, a succession of individuals were escorted into the facility, each one arriving alone, each one spending between 4 and 12 hours reviewing the data before being escorted out again. None of them identified themselves. None of them signed the visitor log, but the analysts, observant by training and increasingly desperate for any scrap of context, noted details. One visitor had the bearing and vocabulary of his senior military commander. Another spoke with a pronounced British accent and carried documents bearing the crest of an organization that one team member tentatively identified as MI6. A third, an elderly man who moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to absolute authority, spent his entire visit listening to the signal playback on headphones, his eyes closed, his expression unreadable, before standing, adjusting his coat, and leaving without a word. Whatever decision was being made about the signal from beneath the moon, it was being made far above the pay grade of anyone in that room. The dissolution began in March. The first to go was the team itself, on a Tuesday morning that those involved would later describe as otherwise entirely ordinary. The analysts arrived at Building 43 to find the freight elevator operational for the first time in weeks. They descended as usual, but when they reached the subterranean level, the room was empty. The consoles were gone. The cots, the coffee machine, the stacks of frequency analysis printouts, the blackboard on which they had mapped the Sumerian tonal correspondences in colored chalk, all of it had vanished. The walls had been repainted. The floor had been scrubbed. The room smelled not of stale coffee and nervous sweat but of fresh industrial solvent, a sharp chemical tang that stung the nostrils and seemed designed not merely to clean but to erase, to chemically obliterate every trace of human occupation. Standing in the center of the empty room was a man in a gray suit who informed them, politely but with an undertone of finality that none of them mistook for negotiation, that their project had been concluded and that they were being reassigned effective immediately. Each analyst was given a sealed envelope containing transfer orders. One was sent to a weather station in Greenland, another to a supply depot in the Philippines, a third to a clerical position at a Veterans Administration hospital in rural Nebraska. Their expertise was irrelevant. Their new assignments required none of the skills that had brought them to the subterranean room. They were being dispersed, scattered across the globe in a pattern designed to ensure that no two of them would ever be in the same city again. But the signal had already escaped its initial containment. In the inter-service chaos of the late 1950s, information had a way of seeping through the cracks of even the most rigorous compartmentalization. Rumors reached the newly formed National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which had come into existence in July of 1958, just months before LR-7 flight. A small group within NASA's fledgling Office of Space Sciences, aware that something extraordinary had been detected during a lunar flyby they were never told about, began assembling their own investigation. They worked discreetly, pulling data from publicly available radio astronomy surveys, cross-referencing orbital mechanics calculations, trying to reconstruct from the outside what had been discovered within. By the summer of 1959, they had produced a preliminary report that, while lacking access to the original signal data, correctly identified the approximate frequency, range, and the lunar coordinates of the anomaly source. The report was circulated among a handful of senior NASA officials. Within 6 weeks, the Office of Space Sciences was reorganized. The group was disbanded. Its members were transferred to unrelated programs. The report itself was withdrawn from internal circulation, and the filing cabinet in which copies had been stored was removed from the office by personnel who presented credentials from no identifiable agency. It was the first but far from the last time that an institution would dissolve in the wake of contact with the lunar signal. The pattern repeated with a consistency that defied coincidence. In 1960, a joint committee of the National Security Council and the President's Science Advisory Committee was quietly convened to assess what one surviving memorandum describes as persistent anomalous electromagnetic phenomena of potential extraterrestrial origin detected in the cislunar environment. The committee met 4 times over 3 months, each meeting held at a different location and attended by a rotating cast of military, intelligence, and scientific officials. Their deliberations remain entirely unknown. No minutes have ever surfaced, no recordings have ever been acknowledged, and the committee members themselves, to the extent that they have been identified at all, universally declined to comment in the decades that followed. What is known is that the committee's mandate was abruptly terminated in the autumn of 1960, its members informed by letter that their services were no longer required and that all materials related to their work were to be surrendered immediately. The letter bore no signature. The committee had no successor. In Britain, a parallel investigation conducted under the auspices of the Royal Astronomical Society's Classified Programs Division met a similar fate. A group of 5 astronomers and 2 linguists assembled in the spring of 1961 produced 3 months of analysis before being informed that their funding had been revoked and their security clearances downgraded. 2 of the astronomers subsequently emigrated, 1 to Australia and 1 to South Africa. The linguists returned to academic positions and never published again. The pattern was unmistakable. To investigate the signal was to invite institutional annihilation. What makes the suppression so remarkable is not merely its thoroughness, but its longevity. Classified programs are common in the world of defense and intelligence. Projects are born, they produce results or they fail, and they are filed away in the vast archival warrens of the national security state. But they leave traces, budget lines, personnel records, facility maintenance logs. The bureaucratic residue of institutional activity is nearly impossible to eliminate entirely, and it is this residue that historians and journalists have exploited for decades to reconstruct the hidden history of programs from the Manhattan Project to MKUltra. The lunar signal investigation left almost nothing. It is as if the bureaucratic machinery that normally sustained classified work was deliberately dismantled from the inside, not merely shut down but taken apart at the molecular level, its components scattered so widely that reassembly would be functionally impossible. The few documents that have surfaced over the decades have done so through accidents, through estate sales, through the carelessness of aging veterans who forgot which papers they were supposed to have burned. And even these fragments raise more questions than they answer, because they suggest that the suppression was not the work of any single agency or government. It was coordinated, it was international, and it was ongoing, not a one-time act of classification, but a continuous, active process of erasure that persisted for years, possibly decades, after the original discovery. Someone, or something, wanted the signal forgotten, and they were willing to dismantle any structure, dissolve any institution. silence any voice that threatened to remember. The question of why invites speculation that ranges from the plausible to the profoundly disturbing. The most conservative explanation, the one favored by those who approach this subject with the caution of trained historians, is that the signal represented a national security concern of the highest order. If the moon harbored an artificial structure capable of transmitting organized electromagnetic signals, then the implications for the space race were staggering. The nation that understood and potentially controlled such a structure would possess an advantage so overwhelming that it would render the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union moot. From this perspective, the suppression was simply an extreme but rational act of information control, an attempt to prevent the Soviets from learning what the Americans had found and potentially reaching the source first. But this explanation, while tidy, fails to account for several troubling details. It does not explain why the British investigation was also suppressed, given that Britain was a NATO ally with deeply integrated intelligence sharing arrangements with the United States. It does not explain why the suppression continued long after the space race had ended, long after the Soviet Union itself had collapsed. And it does not explain the one detail that, more than any other, has haunted the researchers who have attempted to reconstruct this story over the decades. It does not explain the silence of the astronauts. Between 1969 and 1972, 12 human beings walked on the surface of the moon. They traversed its dusty plains, collected its rocks, planted its flags, drove its rudimentary vehicles across terrain that no living eyes had ever beheld. And not one of them, in any public statement, in any memoir, in any interview conducted over the half-century since the Apollo program ended, has ever acknowledged the existence of the signal. This silence is, on its face, unremarkable. If the signal was classified, then the astronauts would have been bound by their security oaths not to discuss it. But the nature of their silence is peculiar. Several Apollo astronauts, in the years following their missions, became known for making cryptic, sometimes startling public statements about what they had experienced on the moon. Edgar Mitchell, the lunar module pilot of Apollo 14, spent the later decades of his life advocating for the disclosure of information about extraterrestrial contact, founding the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and giving interviews in which he stated flatly that humanity was not alone in the universe and that governments were concealing this fact. Buzz Aldrin, the second human to set foot on the lunar surface, spoke repeatedly of a strange object that had accompanied Apollo 11 during its translunar journey. Neil Armstrong, the most famous of them all, retreated into an almost monastic privacy after his return from the moon, granting few interviews and appearing visibly uncomfortable on the rare occasions when he was drawn into public discussion of his experience. These men knew something. The texture of their silence, the way it bent and strained over the decades, suggests not the disciplined reticence of professionals keeping a routine secret, but the profound, almost spiritual burden of individuals carrying knowledge too heavy to share and too important to forget. There is a passage in the Sumerian text known as the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest narrative compositions in human history that has troubled scholars for generations. It describes the moment when the god Enlil, enraged by the noise of humanity, the clamor of their proliferating civilization, the unceasing din of their existence, resolves to destroy them. He sends first plague, then drought, then finally the deluge, the great flood that would be inherited by later traditions and become the story of Noah, the story of Gilgamesh, the foundational catastrophe narrative of Western civilization. But before the destruction, before the waters rise, there is a detail that is easy to overlook. Enlil does not merely decide, he convenes a council. He gathers the Anunnaki, the great gods, in an assembly, and he binds them to an oath of secrecy. The destruction of humanity is to be carried out in silence. No warning is to be given. No god is to speak of what is coming. The oath is absolute, and its violation by the god Enki, who whispers a warning to the hero Atrahasis through a reed wall, constitutes one of the central dramatic tensions of the entire epic. What is remarkable about this passage is not its narrative content, but its structural resonance with the pattern we have been tracing. A discovery is made, a council is convened, an oath of silence is imposed, and those who violate the silence face consequences. The parallel is imperfect, as all parallels between myth and history must be, but it is also impossible to ignore. The oldest story we possess about the relationship between gods and humanity is a story about the enforcement of silence, and the modern history of the lunar signal is a history of the same. Consider what it would mean if the signal were genuine, not a misinterpretation, not an instrument malfunction, not a reflection of terrestrial radio contamination bounced back from the lunar surface. Consider the possibility that something beneath the moon, something constructed, Something old, something that has endured the vacuum and the radiation and the cosmic bombardment for longer than we can comfortably contemplate, has been transmitting a repeating signal whose harmonic structure corresponds to a hymn composed by human beings in the 4th millennium before Christ. The implications cascade in every direction simultaneously, each one more destabilizing than the last. If the signal is artificial, then the moon is not what we believe it to be. It is not merely a natural satellite captured by Earth's gravity or formed from the debris of an ancient collision. It is, at minimum, a site of activity by an intelligence that predates or is contemporary with the earliest human civilizations. If the signal matches a Sumerian hymn, then either the Sumerians had knowledge of whatever produced the signal, or whatever produced the signal had knowledge of the Sumerians. In either case, the boundary between human history and non-human activity dissolves. The Sumerian texts, long treated by mainstream scholarship as the imaginative productions of a proliferate culture groping toward meaning in a hostile world, become something else entirely. They become testimony, they become records. And the gods they described, Enlil and Enki and Anu and Inanna, and the entire bewildering, magnificent, terrifying pantheon of ancient Mesopotamia, cease to be metaphors and become entities whose existence must be reckoned with not as a matter of faith but as a matter of evidence. The city of Nippur lies in modern-day Iraq, in the flat, sun-hammered plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, where the temperature in summer can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit and the dust devils spin across the landscape like restless ghosts. It was excavated systematically beginning in the 1880s by teams from the University of Pennsylvania, and the tablets they recovered, tens of thousands of them, transformed our understanding of the ancient world. Among these tablets were the hymns to Enlil, composed in a script so ancient that deciphering it required decades of scholarly effort and the collaborative work of linguists across multiple continents. The hymns describe Enlil's power in language that is simultaneously poetic and visceral. They speak of his word as a force that shakes the heavens, of his gaze as a fire that consumes, of his breath as the wind that moves across the face of the deep. They describe the Eker, his temple, not merely as a building but as a cosmic axis, a point of connection between the world of humans and the world of gods, a place where the boundary between the earthly and the divine was thin enough to permit passage. And they describe sounds, the sounds of worship, the specific tonal patterns and rhythmic structures of the liturgical music that was performed in his honor, music that the priests of Nippur believed could reach across the void and touch the divine ear. If Dr. M's analysis was correct, if the tonal patterns she identified in the lunar signal truly correspond to these ancient hymns, then the music composed to reach the gods was not a prayer launched into indifferent silence. It was a response, a reply to a signal that had been broadcasting from the moon for millennia before the first reed stylus pressed the first wedge-shaped mark into wet Mesopotamian clay. There are those who have attempted, over the decades, to pursue this investigation through unofficial channels. They are a scattered community, connected by encrypted correspondence and anonymous message boards, by self-published monographs distributed in limited editions, and academic papers submitted to journals that reject them with form letters. They are former intelligence analysts who retained fragments of data they were supposed to destroy. They are radio astronomers who, during long nights at remote observatories, have trained their dishes on Oceanus Procellarum and listened. They are Assyriologists who stumbled upon Dr. M's work through chains of citations so convoluted that tracing them feels like solving a labyrinth. And they are, to a person, haunted, not by what they have found, because most of them have found frustratingly little. The suppression was too thorough, the erasure too complete. They are haunted by the absences, by the gaps in the record that are too clean, too symmetrical, too perfectly shaped to be accidental. They speak of files that should exist but do not, of personnel records that end abruptly, as if the people they describe simply ceased to be, of observatory logbooks with pages removed so carefully that the binding shows no damage, of a pattern of negation so precise that it constitutes its own form of evidence, a shadow cast by an object so large and so close that looking at it directly is impossible. You can only see it by the darkness it creates around itself. In 2009, NASA Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter began its comprehensive mapping of the moon's surface, producing images of extraordinary resolution, detailed enough to show the tracks left by the Apollo rovers, the boot prints of astronauts preserved in the ancient dust. Among the hundreds of thousands of images released to the public, a small number depicting the region of Oceanus Procellarum attracted attention from the unofficial research community. In several frames, there appeared to be linear features beneath the surface. visible only in the thermal imaging data, where variations in subsurface temperature created subtle patterns that the visible light cameras could not detect. These features were geometrically regular, arranged in configurations that were difficult to attribute to natural geological processes. NASA official analysis attributed them to ancient lava tubes, subsurface channels carved by flowing magma billions of years ago and subsequently collapsed, leaving linear depressions detectable by thermal variation. This explanation is scientifically plausible. Lava tubes are a well-documented feature of lunar geology, but the unofficial researchers noted that the features in question were located in precisely the region from which the 1958 signal had emanated, and that their geometric regularity exceeded anything observed in confirmed lava tube formations elsewhere on the Moon. One researcher, publishing anonymously, overlaid the thermal data with a grid derived from the frequency analysis of the original signal and claimed to find a spatial correspondence between the subsurface features and the harmonic intervals of the Sumerian hymn, as if the structure beneath the surface were not merely transmitting the signal but was itself shaped by it, a physical manifestation of the music, an architecture of sound frozen in stone. The idea that a structure beneath the Moon could encode information in both its electromagnetic emissions and its physical geometry is not as outlandish as it might appear to those unfamiliar with the history of attempts to design interstellar messages. In the 1970s and 1980s, scientists involved in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence devoted considerable thought to the question of how an advanced civilization might construct a signal that could be understood by recipients who shared no common language, no common biology, no common frame of reference. The consensus that emerged was that mathematics and physics, the universal languages of the cosmos, would form the basis of any such communication. Frequencies that corresponded to natural constants, pulse patterns that encoded prime numbers, geometric relationships embedded in signal structures. The lunar signal, if it is what the unofficial researchers believe it to be, would represent an astonishing elaboration of this principle, a message encoded not merely in electromagnetic radiation, but in the physical fabric of the structure that produced it, a message designed to be understood at multiple levels simultaneously, accessible to anyone with the technology to detect radio signals and the cultural memory to recognize the hymn. It is, in this interpretation, a message designed specifically for a civilization that has both reached for the stars and retained its connection to its most ancient past. It is a message designed for us, and the question that follows, the question that presses against the walls of this narrative like water against a dam, is devastatingly simple. What does it say? The answer, if it exists at all, may lie in the one document that the unofficial research community has spent decades trying to locate, a document they refer to simply as the translation. According to the fragmented accounts that have trickled out over the years, Dr. N did not merely identify the correspondence between the lunar signal and the Sumerian hymn. She went further, working with the frequency data in the weeks before the project was dissolved. She began to develop an interpretive framework for the portions of the signal that did not correspond to any known hymn, the segments that fell between the recognizable liturgical passages like silence between the verses of a song. She believed these segments contained information encoded in a system that used Sumerian tonal values as a kind of Rosetta Stone, a key that allowed access to a deeper layer of meaning. Her notes, according to those who claim to have seen fragments of them, describe this deeper layer in language that oscillated between scholarly precision and something approaching awe. She wrote of numerical sequences that appeared to describe astronomical phenomena with an accuracy that exceeded anything the Sumerians could have observed. She wrote of geometric relationships that suggested an understanding of spatial dimensions beyond the three that human beings inhabit. And she wrote, in what appears to be one of her final entries before the project was terminated, of a warning. A warning so explicit and so dire that she underlined it 3 times and added, in the margin, a notation in Sumerian cuneiform that translates, roughly, as the word has been spoken and cannot be taken back. What was the warning? The fragments do not say, or rather, they say too many things, filtered through too many layers of rumor and speculation and desperate interpretation to be distilled into a single coherent statement. Some researchers believe the warning concerned the moon itself, that the signal was a beacon designed to indicate the presence of something dangerous, a quarantine marker of the kind that has been theorized in discussions of how an advanced civilization might designate hazardous regions of space. Others believe the warning was about Earth, that the signal described an event, a cyclical catastrophe, a recurring cataclysm of the kind described in flood myths and destruction narratives across every human culture, and that the timing of the signal's detection in 1958 was not coincidental but calibrated, triggered by some threshold of technological development that indicated humanity had reached a stage where the warning might be understood. Still others, and these are the researchers whose voices carry the weight of the most evidence, fragmented though it is, believe that the warning was about the act of listening itself, that the signal was a test, that detecting it, analyzing it, understanding it, set in motion a chain of consequences that the warning was designed to describe but not to prevent, that the dissolution of every agency that investigated the signal was not the work of human governments protecting a secret but the fulfillment of a protocol embedded in the signal itself. A protocol that ensured any civilization that heard the signal would respond in a predictable way, by silencing those who heard it, by burying the knowledge, by enacting on a societal level the same oath of secrecy that Enlil imposed upon the Anunnaki in the Atrahasis epic. The signal did not merely carry a message, it carried a compulsion, and every institution that touched it obeyed. This is the possibility that turns the blood cold. Not that we are being watched, not that we are being contacted, but that we are being managed. That the signal from beneath the moon is not a message in a bottle cast adrift by a vanished intelligence, but an active instrument of control, a tool designed to shape the behavior of any civilization that encounters it. The Sumerians in this reading were not merely a civilization that worshipped sky gods, they were a civilization that had been programmed, at a fundamental cultural level, by exposure to a signal that predated their existence by epochs. The hymns to Enlil were not compositions, they were transcriptions. The tonal patterns that Dr. M recognized in the lunar data were not parallels but originals, the source code from which the Sumerian liturgical tradition was derived, and the institution of organized religion, the hierarchical structures of priest and worshipper, of sacred knowledge concealed from the profane, of silence and posed as a divine command, was not a human invention but an implanted behavior, a response triggered by exposure to a signal designed to organize emerging civilizations along specific lines. The gods did not merely descend, they left instructions, and we have been following them ever since, not because we choose to, but because the instructions are embedded so deeply in our cultural and cognitive architecture that we cannot distinguish them from our own thoughts. The silence surrounding the lunar signal is not a conspiracy, it is a reflex. It is what the signal was designed to produce. And so we return to the room beneath Building 43, the room that was emptied and scrubbed, the room that smelled of chemical solvent and institutional denial, the room where a small group of extraordinary minds heard something that the rest of the world was not permitted to know. The elevator shaft has been sealed for decades. The building itself has been renovated, repurposed, its corridors walked by people who have no idea what lies beneath their feet. The analysts are dead or scattered or silent, their names forgotten, their work erased, their contributions to the greatest discovery in human history reduced to whispers exchanged among strangers on encrypted channels. Dr. M vanished from the academic record entirely. Her publications ceased, her institutional affiliations dissolved, her colleagues, when contacted by researchers in later decades, claimed to have no memory of her. The probe, LR7, has no entry in any database. The signal continues, presumably, to broadcast from beneath Oceanus Procellarum, its 47-second cycle repeating with the same mechanical precision it displayed in October of 1958, indifferent to the rise and fall of the civilizations that might hear it, patient beyond any human understanding of patience. It is singing. It has always been singing. And the question that we must ask ourselves, the question that presses against the surface of our comfortable ignorance with the weight of the entire moon behind it, is not whether we will listen. We have already listened. The question is whether we are capable of hearing what was said, whether the structures of silence that were erected around the signal, the dissolved agencies and the scattered analysts and the buried rooms and the 6 years of meticulous, tireless suppression, are walls that were built to keep us from the truth or walls that were built to protect us from it. The hymn to Enlil rises from beneath the dust of the ocean of storms, a prayer that predates the language in which it was first transcribed by millennia uncountable. It rises, and it repeats, and it waits. And somewhere in the space between the signal and the silence, in the gap between what was heard and what was hidden, the truth endures, patient as stone, old as the dark between the stars, singing to a world that has been taught, by forces it cannot name, to cover its ears and look away. But the signal does not care whether we look away. It was not designed for our comfort. It was not designed for our era. It was designed for a span of time so vast that human history, all of it, Every empire and every extinction, every revelation and every forgetting, fits within a single pulse of its 47-second cycle like a heartbeat within a geological age. We are, in the face of such patience, less than ephemeral. We are the dust that settles on the surface above the singing stone. And yet we heard it. For the week in the autumn of 1958, in a room that ability water to win, a handful of human beings intent to believe even heard of them that was not meant for them, or was meant for them in ways they could not them, and for a moment the hatred between what we are and what we thought we are to thought of that's all in our water. That moment was taken from them. It was taken from all of us, but the signal remains. Beneath the silence, beneath the regolith, beneath the weight of decades of suppression and denial and institutional cowardice, the signal remains. It is older than Sumer, is older than the moon, and it is, perhaps, older than the silence that surrounds it, singing in a register that human ears were never meant to hear, in a language that human minds were never meant to understand, for reasons that human hearts were never meant to bear. The ocean of storm stretches gray and silent beneath the black sky, unmarked, undisturbed, keeping its secrets with the fidelity of the dead. But beneath the surface, in the dark, something remembers, something repeats, and something waits with the patience of a God who has already spoken his word and knows with the certainty of eternity that it cannot be taken back.